Welcome to Libeth. We are reading Japanese fairy tales by Yei Theodora Ozaki, and we have reached the final video in the series. In the last video, we worked through the moral and social architecture of the collection, duty, obligation, the precise economy of virtue rewarded and greed destroyed. The world of spirits and nature and impermanence, the world in which the forest is not scenery, but a party to everything that happens within it, in which the boundary between human and non-human is real and porous, and carries a cost in both directions, in which happiness is always fragile and always known to be fragile, and in which the story of a culture preserving its own identity through the act of telling and retelling is itself one of the deepest themes the collection contains. The natural world in these stories is not scenery. It is not the backdrop against which human events unfold. It is a party to every event, watchful, responsive, consequential, possessed of its own interior life, that is not identical to human interior life, but is not foreign to it either. The forest knows when you enter it in the wrong spirit. The river knows what you threw into it and why. The mountain has a position on your presence on its slopes that it will eventually make known. This is not animism as primitive error, as a prescientific misattribution of agency to inert matter. It is animism as a worked-out cosmological position. The world is constituted by relationships between conscious beings, of which humans are one kind, and the ethical life is the practice of maintaining those relationships correctly. Shinto does not have a theology of nature as distinct from a theology of human life, because the distinction itself is not available to it. The kami who inhabit the world are not supernatural in the sense of being above or beyond nature. They are nature, understood as conscious and relational. What this means for the stories is that the encounter with the spirit world is never exotic in the way a Western reader tends to experience it. When the fisherman meets the daughter of the Dragon King, he has not crossed into another dimension. He has gone deeper into the world he already lives in, the underwater dimension of the same world, inhabited by beings with more power and longer memory than the humans who live on its surface, but continuous with it rather than separate from it. This is a fundamentally different metaphysics from the one encoded in Western fairy tales, where the supernatural is almost always positioned as an exception. The fairy godmother who appears at a specific moment of need, the magical object that operates according to rules unavailable to ordinary life, the enchanted forest that exists at the edge of the known world and must be approached with special preparation. In the Japanese tradition, the spirit world is not at the edge of the known world. It is the depth of it. You can reach it by going far enough out to sea, or deep enough into a mountain, or by falling asleep in the right place, or simply by being the kind of person that the kami choose to address. The threshold is everywhere. The crossing is available to anyone, though not equally. The impermanence encoded in these stories is the aesthetic and philosophical heart of the collection, and it operates at every level simultaneously. It is in the structural arc of the tales, joy arrived at, briefly held, inevitably lost, in the way that the undersea palace is beautiful partly because you know, even as Urashima is living in it, that it cannot last. It is in the specific images that recur across multiple stories. The cherry blossom, which blooms for a week and is then gone, and which the Japanese aesthetic tradition treats not as a frustration, but as the concentrated form of beauty. That impermanence is not a defect of beauty, but its condition, that the thing that passes quickly is beautiful in a way that permanent things cannot be. And it is in the deepest structural feature of the moral economy. The happiness that is achieved through virtue and supernatural favor is always fragile, always bounded, always dependent on the continuation of the conditions that produced it. The crane wife will stay as long as the taboo holds. The Dragon King's gift can be used wisely or wasted. The box can remain sealed. But the story always knows, and you always know, reading it, that the condition will not hold forever, that the choice that ends everything will eventually be made, and that the knowledge of this does not make the joy less real, but simply adds to it the particular weight of things that are known to be temporary. The mano no aware that runs through all of this, usually translated as the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, is not a sentiment in these stories. It is a way of seeing. It is the quality of attention that the story trains you to bring to everything beautiful within it. The awareness that each moment of happiness is being held in the knowledge of its ending. The sensitivity to season, to the quality of light at particular times of year, to the specific emotional register appropriate to each moment of natural and human transition. All of this was a practice of staying present to impermanence, of not averting the gaze from the fact of ending, because the averting was understood to be not only aesthetically coarse, but spiritually impoverished. You could not be fully alive in a moment if you were not fully aware that it would end. And the stories that encode this understanding ask you to carry that awareness through them, to feel the joy of the undersea palace with the knowledge of what will happen to the man who chose to stay in it, to feel the warmth of the crane wife's presence with the knowledge of what the husband will eventually do. The magical object functions in these tales as a test of character in precisely the sense that the spirit world functions as a test of character. Not by presenting the protagonist with a choice between good and evil, which would be too easy, but by presenting them with a choice between their essential nature and the temptation of something that appears to be its fulfillment. The lucky mallet that grants wishes is not dangerous because it produces bad wishes. It is dangerous because it produces wishes that are too large, wishes that exceed the social equilibrium, that accumulate so much at the top that the bottom is destroyed, or that pulls so much toward one person that the web of mutual obligation that constitutes community is torn. The greedy person who gets the mallet first thinks they have one. What they have actually done is handed themselves the mechanism of their own destruction, because they will use it in ways that demonstrate exactly the quality that the universe is about to punish. The object is a mirror. What you do with it is what you are. And what you are, in these stories, determines everything that happens next. The isolation-exile-return pattern is one of the deepest structural constants across world mythology. And in the Japanese fairy tale tradition, it carries a specific social meaning that is worth unpacking. The hero who is isolated or exiled before the adventure begins is almost always isolated at the social level. The youngest son, the orphan, the childless old couple, the person who has somehow ended up at the margins of the community through no fault of their own. This marginality is not a moral failing. It is a structural position that the story treats as both a vulnerability and an opportunity. Vulnerability because the person without full social integration lacks the protections that community provides. Opportunity because the same marginality that excludes them from the normal social order makes them available to the encounter with the spirit world, which, as the stories consistently show, tends to choose its interlocutors from the edges rather than the center of human communities. The center is too busy maintaining its position to be open to what the margins can receive. The return that completes the pattern is always a return to the community, to household, village, family, not to the spirit world, not to the magical space in which the adventure occurred. This is important. The Japanese fairy tale, unlike some Western versions of the hero's journey, does not suggest that the experience of the supernatural permanently elevates the protagonist above ordinary life. It suggests the opposite, that the value of the supernatural encounter is precisely its capacity to restore the hero to ordinary life in a condition that makes that life sustainable, with enough resources to care for aging parents, to maintain the household, to fulfill the obligations that the social order requires. The Dragon King's treasure is not for transcendence. It is for living. And the living, returned to, is the point. Folk narrative as preservation of cultural identity is the theme that makes the collection most fully a product of its specific moment. Meiji Japan, 1903, the anxious hinge between a civilization that had existed for over a millennium and the modernized state that was being built on its foundations. The stories were being told in a new form, written, translated, published for foreign readers, at exactly the moment when the oral traditions that had sustained them were losing their natural context. The village culture in which a grandmother tells a grandchild the story of Mamatero by the fire, in the knowledge that the child will tell it to their grandchild in the same way, is not the culture in which Ozaki was publishing. It is the culture that Meiji modernization was in the process of dissolving. What the book is doing, inadvertently, not programmatically, is freezing a particular version of those stories at a particular moment of cultural transition, preserving not the living tradition but its form, the shape of the stories and their moral architecture, drained of some of the specific social context that had given them their full meaning, but not drained of the deep structure that made them worth telling across so many centuries. The irony that makes the collection historically poignant is the irony of all mediated preservation. The form in which these stories survived into the 20th century, the form in which most people outside Japan encountered them, is Ozaki's English version, which is to say, a Victorian woman's reconstruction of tales she encountered through intermediaries, adapted for readers who knew nothing of Mono no Aware, or the Ai system, or the specific weight of the crane in Shinto symbolism. And yet the bones survive. The structure of the moral economy, the logic of the spirit world encounter, the irreversibility of certain transgressions, the fragility of happiness, these come through even the adaptation because they are too fundamental to be edited away. They are what these stories are, underneath everything else. Ozaki's book ends, as all collections end, with a kind of silence. The silence after the last story, when the mechanism has run its final iteration and the bones have said what bones can say. What you are left with is not a complete picture of Japanese civilization, not a faithful preservation of the oral tradition, not even a fully coherent argument. What you are left with is the residue of 1,000 years of thinking, filtered through one woman's particular moment and particular position between worlds, arriving in your hands in a form that is imperfect and mediated and still, despite everything, capable of asking the questions that do not go away. What do you owe the world? What is the cost of looking when you were told not to look? What remains when the spirit departs and the magic is over and you are standing in a village that does not recognize you, holding a box you should not have opened? These are not ancient questions. They are the questions you brought with you when you started reading. The stories just gave them a shape. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.